How to make earnings in Solo Victory Cup finals in Season 4. We're going to be covering all these key areas, so strap in and enjoy the video. So starting off, we're going to be covering practice and how you can actually prepare for these Solo Victory Cups. This video is going to be more finals focused, so if you're struggling to get through to opens, make sure to watch this video. To be good in finals, there's two different areas that you need to master. The first being fighting, so this will cover your off-spawn fights, but also mid-game if you're getting pushed or if you need to push someone for a refresh. It's important because you obviously want to stay alive, but also the loot you get from these fights is going to get you closer to endgame, which is where the earnings are. The best methods to practice fighting are ranked, but making sure you push everyone you see. Landing your drop spot every game also helps you learn how to fight there. More on this later in the video. And the other is creative, which has several forms. Zone wars and builds are both going to be better for improving your mechanics, but also learning new retakes. Whereas realistics are a bit more box fighty and mimic real games. So make sure to incorporate all these into your routines so you become a better fighter. The other part of finals is obviously endgame. As everyone's trying to make earnings, every game will have stacked moving zones, meaning you need to be good in endgames if you want a shot of getting earnings. The best way to practice these is through solo scrims. Just try to find a scrim server where the endgames are actually stacked with good players. If the endgames are worse than ranked and you're winning every game, it's probably not going to be challenging enough for you to improve. Some servers have zone rules where you're not allowed to fight anyone before certain zones. This makes endgames much more stacked, but on the flip side, it's not good for mid-game practice as it's so unrealistic. If you've qualified and played previous Solo Victory Cup finals, you should know where you're weak. If you're never actually making it to endgames, then you need to practice your fighting. But if you are consistently getting to endgames but never getting the earnings, then you need to practice your endgames. This should be prioritized in your practice. Now let's move on to warm-up. If you want to ensure you have the best chance of making finals, then you need to make sure you're properly warmed up. Common warm-up routines used by the pros is warming up aim by playing maps like aim duels, mechanics by free building and edit course and piece control maps. Once they've warmed up their aim and mechanics, they then get on to warming up their fighting. As mentioned earlier, this can be done in zone wars, builds or realistics. Again, you actually want this to be quite challenging to ensure you're properly warmed up. Instead of practicing the edits you're good at, throw in the ones you're not good at in case they come up in game. And when fighting in creative, make sure you're matching against good players. If you're 10-0 in someone, it's not going to mimic the players you're probably going to come up against, especially in high elo. However, on the flip side, you don't want your warm-ups to be too long or hard, as this can have adverse effects. If you're fully locked in and warm up for a whole 2 hours before the tournament, by the time the tournament starts, you're going to be exhausted and you're not going to have much focus. According to several top coaches, the most optimal time to warm up is between 30 to 45 minutes. Now let's talk about playstyles. There are two main types: passive and aggressive. Aggressive players like to W key and take a lot of fights, mainly because they are good fighters and they win the majority of their engagements. Whereas passive players try to avoid taking as many fights and prefer to play for endgame, which is where their strengths lie. Knowing what playstyle you are is helpful because it guides you towards what you should and shouldn't do in your final games. Although no elim points in finals, aggressive players are still rewarded by getting kills, because as long as they don't play silly and push everyone, these kills can be considered refreshes, and that better loot can increase their chances of winning the game. Whereas passive players shouldn't really be looking to take fights, as they are likely to encounter better fighters than them. On to drop spots. A common mistake that a lot of people think is there's a magic formula when it comes to where you land. This is not true at all, and the best drop spot is the one best suited to you. Where you'll want to land goes back to the whole playstyle thing. The good fighters can land at the top POIs that has better loot, as they don't mind getting into fights, which is likely to occur to the amount of players landing there. Whereas passive players shouldn't land places like this and should instead opt for split drops. The lower your fighting skills, the lower amount of chests you should be landed on. Another thing to consider is whether you want to land edge or center map. If you land center map, you have the advantage of never having bad zones, because wherever zone pulls, you can just rotate early and you'll get there before everyone else. However, on edge map, the players are often more split out. Excluding POIs, there will likely be more chests per person. And it will also be easier to fight due to less third party, because less people will be rotating into you, unlike center map. You can choose to have multiple drop spots depending on bus path, elo, and game importance. Wherever you decide to land, I would highly recommend getting a drop map to ensure you beat everyone's drops. The easiest way to acquire good ones is to pay, but don't worry, they are cheap. If you don't want to pay, I have a video on how to make them for free. When it comes to choosing a loadout for Solo Victory Cup finals, a Flowberry Fizz is obviously essential because it's the only movement item in this current meta. For your first weapon, you want to be carrying this Striker AR. It's amazing in box fight scenarios because of the fast fire rate. It's good at long range because of the accuracy, but it's also amazing at applying pressure because of the fast fire rate. For shotgun, it largely depends on what's your favorite and what you're best with. All three are viable with the Striker AR, but hands down, by far the best shotgun in the game for multiple seasons is the Gatekeeper. Hear me out, with the drum mag. So if you can get in a bunker and get this attachment, then you're set. It almost does more damage than a pump, it shoots like a tack, and it has 5-hole bullets with a drum mag, meaning you're never going to run out of ammo and need to reload. Then that leaves you with 2 slots for more heals. Chug splashers are essential because they're quick to pop, but also people can hear you popping these, meaning they're really good for fights. They're one of the only consumables that does HP and shield, which means if you don't take a lot of damage in endgame, you can actually use these as a heal off item. Talking of heal off, the last item is obviously medkits. You might be thinking to yourself, 1 stack of medkits is not going to be enough to win heal off. Although I've seen it happen, you're probably right, but these 3 medkits are going to be the bare minimum for us. It's almost guaranteed that you're going to need at least 1 refresh in endgame. Once you get this, you can actually take another stack of medkits instead of an item you no longer need, aka a fizz or AR. This is more preferable to a 1-gun loadout because we don't want to run into any surge problems, but we also want to make sure we survive in any fights we could get into. In the case that you don't need a refresh or they don't have any medkits, then it's not the end of the world, because in endgame what you should be doing is pinning loot and medkits to go back to in a heal off. You can also look for any drop medallions on the map, as there's likely to be a lot of loot in this area. Early game is arguably the most important part of the game. There's a high chance that you could die if contested off spawn, but also depending on what loot you get off spawn highly dictates your game. The first step to ensuring you survive off spawn is what I mentioned earlier, and it's having a drop map, especially if your drop is a smaller 50-50 spot, because if you get out dropped you're going to die. Having the best drop off spawn means you're not instantly going to die, you're going to start looting quicker than your opponent, and you might even be able to get a few tags off on them. The number one way to make sure you're winning these off spawn fights is to know your drop spot inside out and know how to gain an advantage on your opponent. This can come in several forms like HP advantage, natural high ground, but also loot and material advantage. To get more loot and materials than your opponent, you need to have an optimized loot path. This means looting and farming in one direction and not doubling back on yourself in the quickest time possible. The best way to find the most optimal loot path is to plan it out on Fortnite.gg, and for materials you need to know what gives the most materials just by playing and landing at that spot a lot. A mistake a lot of people make is thinking they have to fight off spawn if contested. However, even with pros being the best in the game, we often still see them split POIs and then just disengage. Mid-game is make or break for a lot of players. I've seen it so many times where players have the best loot off spawn and then they just go and throw their game away in mid-game. The key to mastering mid-games is having good rotates and positioning to ensure you have the best loot possible going into end games. Having good rotates is knowing where and when to rotate. This will be different every game, but the key is to limit how many people you will bump into on rotate. For timing, you can rotate early, meaning you'll get to where you want to before everyone else, or you could go late, allowing everyone to go ahead of you and edge storm, or even stay in storm. Not many players are comfortable staying in storm, so if you do this technique, you're likely to encounter little players. However, if you do this, make sure you have whites and don't do it too late into final games, because you will get storm sickness, which will affect heal offs. Be careful, because there's also a risk that you may get held in zone or someone might try and storm fight you. For rotates and positioning, there's 2 areas that you'll want to be, but one area that you want to avoid at all costs. That is the congested side of zone. You can always work out where this is going to be, because wherever zone pulls, the opposite side of zone is going to be the congested side. For example, if zone pulls top right, the congested side of zone is going to be bottom left. because this is the quickest way to white line into zone for the majority of the map. It's going to be so many players, so try to avoid these areas because it's way more likely you're going to end up in a fight, and the next zones are going to be so much harder to rotate to with everyone bumping into each other, and you're going to use a lot of mats and hills. On the other hand, the best places to position is on dead side and center zone. If you position center zone, you're going to have the advantage of being able to get many storm surge tags. You're going to pull a lot of future zones, but if you don't, you're never going to have a bad zone to rotate to. Dead side is the opposite to the congested side of zone, and it's usually on the edge of map where zone pulls. The benefits of positioning and rotating dead side are there's very few players, meaning you're going to get into less fights, but also take less damage, meaning you can keep your heals and materials. Even if you get a bad zone pull, it should still be pretty risk-free. Knowing how to play endgame in Solo Victory Cup finals is the most important thing to get you closer to earnings. You can still play dead side in endgame, it's just a bit harder to keep track of where it is. But with practice on remembering where the zone has previously pulled and using visual cues, previous zones pulled, but also using visual cues, you should start to get good on knowing where to be. One of the most important aspects of endgame is refreshes. It's almost impossible to win one of these stacked final games without getting one single refresh. Not only will you run out of materials, but you should also look for a refresh to get more medkits to win a heal off. The key part in getting refreshes is to make sure you don't wait too late. It's no good to only start looking for kills once you've completely run out of mats, because trying to get that kill is going to be hard. So I recommend to start looking for refreshes when you still have a few hundred mats. But if you could get them even earlier than that, then that takes the pressure away. However, you don't want to do the opposite. A common mistake I always see a lot of players make is going for refreshes when they have nearly capped mats. There's no point taking the risk in dying when there's no reward, especially in final lobbies where you don't get any elim points. Being good at layer changing is one of the best skills you can have for endgame. Knowing when to switch layer to prevent getting cut off and dying is going to keep you alive for much longer. However, try to prevent going full low ground when you still have a lot of mats, because this is where a lot of the scuff players are with no mats, and they will try and hop in your box. The last and most important part of endgames is getting win conditions. The most common one where the majority of Solo Victory Cup final games are won is high ground. So ensure you're on a high layer and keep checking height to see if there's an opportunity to take it. However, beware, good players will pressure second height a lot and make you lose a lot of materials. Then it goes down to the heal off. More important than how many heals you actually have is making sure you have zero storm sickness. You can do this by making sure you don't take any damage from zone, especially in the later parts of the game. And you want to stay in the circle until it fully shrinks, and then you can run off and try and find more heals. This is why high ground is preferred, because it's so much easier to stay in zone while shrinking. Mentality is what separates most of the pro players from casuals, and it can be the difference whether you make earnings or don't. Solos can be the most infuriating game mode. Combine this with finals where making earnings is on the line, and you have a recipe to smash your setup. One of the best things you can do is stay calm but also have some confidence. This is different for every person. To stay calm whilst playing, some people like to listen to music or being cool with their friends, whereas some players might hate to do anything I've just listed and actually find it more distracting than beneficial. So experiment and find what works for you. Staying calm after you've died is a bit different, because it's not about nerves, it's more about controlling your anger. Going into your next games playing emotional with lack of focus is going to make you play even worse. Again, this is personal preference, but some methods I recommend are just walking away from your desk for a minute, taking deep breaths and going to get a drink. As soon as you die, punish yourself by doing some exercise like push-ups. Have trigger words and actions where you do the same thing every time you die, like say a phrase and then immediately leave the game. And one of my personal favorites that actually leads to improvement is straight away analyzing how you died and how you can fix it for next game. If you play scared and nervous, you're likely going to make a lot of mistakes. This is where confidence comes in. Confidence usually comes with improvement, but something I have heard pros talk about a lot is delusional confidence. This is where even if you aren't the best player in the lobby, it's when you tell yourself in the head you are, and it just makes you play that extra bit better. I put a lot of time into this video to make sure you guys get earnings, so leaving a like would be highly appreciated. To make sure you don't miss any more helpful videos like this, make sure you're subscribed and turn on the notifications. Make sure to comment finals if you stayed till the end of the video, so I can thank my loyal viewers who stayed and watched a whole 14 minutes.